The elevator hummed softly as it ascended, the numbers on the display lighting up one by one. Ethan Chen stared at his reflection in the mirrored doors, his expression taut. His mind replayed the moment he had drafted the resignation letter now clutched in his hands. For 3 years, Reed Enterprises had been his entire world. He had streamlined Alexander Reed's chaotic schedule, diffused client crises, and ensured that the heir to one of the most powerful business empires in the country could focus solely on dominating the boardroom. But the truth of his unspoken feelings for Alexander had worn him thin. Stepping into the bustling office, Ethan felt the familiar rhythm of the place, the muted hum of printers, the clack of heels against polished floors, the muffled voices of high-powered executives in conference rooms. It was a world that functioned like clockwork, thanks to him. At the center of it all was Alexander. Seated at his expansive desk, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of his computer, Alexander exuded effortless authority. His gray eyes flicked from the screen to the stack of papers on his desk as he issued commands into his headset. His tailored suit clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, and every move he made seemed deliberate. Ethan approached slowly, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath as Alexander hung up the call and reached for another folder. "Ethan," Alexander said without looking up, "I need that client report on my desk in 10. Ethan cleared his throat. "It's ready, but I need to talk to you." Alexander paused, his pen hovering above the paper. He finally looked up, his piercing eyes locking onto Ethan. "What's going on?" "I'm resigning," Ethan said, the words coming out firmer than he expected. For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, leaning back in his chair, he arched an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Ethan held out the envelope. "It's time for me to move on. I've been offered another opportunity." Alexander's gaze shifted from the envelope to Ethan's face. His usually unshakable composure cracked ever so slightly. "Why now?" "You've been indispensable to this company, indispensable to me." The weight of those words hit Ethan like a blow, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's just time," he said, his voice steady. Alexander leaned forward, his tone sharp. "If this is about compensation—" "It's not," Ethan interrupted, his voice faltering. "I just need to go." The moment was interrupted by the buzz of Alexander's phone. He glanced at the screen, his fiancée's name flashing. With a sigh, he waved Ethan away, muttering, "Do what you want." Ethan turned and walked out, his chest tight. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he couldn't shake the image of Alexander's unreadable expression. 2 days later, Ethan sat in a sleek downtown coffee shop, still grappling with his decision. His phone buzzed, and the unfamiliar number made him hesitate before answering. "This is Ethan Chen," he said cautiously. "Mr. Chen," came the deep, commanding voice. "This is Sebastian Blackwood." Ethan froze. Everyone in the business world knew Sebastian Blackwood, the enigmatic CEO of Blackwood Industries and Alexander's fiercest rival. "I've heard about your work at Reed Enterprises," Sebastian continued. "I'd like to meet with you. Reed's loss is my gain." Ethan's first instinct was to decline, but curiosity, and the promise of a fresh start, pushed him to accept. The next morning, he found himself in Sebastian's penthouse office, an elegant space with dark wood accents and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Sebastian stood by the window, his green eyes sharp as he turned to greet Ethan. His tailored suit was immaculate, but it was his commanding presence that struck Ethan most. "Ethan Chen," Sebastian said, extending a hand. "I've been following your career for some time." "Thank you for meeting with me," Ethan said, shaking his hand. Sebastian smirked, gesturing for Ethan to sit. "Why did you leave Reed Enterprises?" Ethan hesitated. It was time for a change. Sebastian studied him, his smirk deepening as if he saw through the carefully constructed answer. "Fair enough. I want you on my team. We'll see how you handle a real challenge." Ethan's new role at Blackwood Industries was nothing like his time at Reed Enterprises. At Reed, everything had been about structure and precision. Alexander thrived on control, and Ethan's job was to ensure that everything ran seamlessly. Timelines adhered to, crises averted, details perfected. But Sebastian was an entirely different force. Where Alexander commanded respect through calculated poise, Sebastian exuded power through his unshakable confidence and magnetic charisma. He was unpredictable, unapologetically blunt, and unafraid to take risks. Meetings with him were a whirlwind of ideas and strategies, often punctuated by his sharp wit and searing honesty. At first, Ethan had found the chaos disorienting, but as the days went on, he discovered something unexpected. He liked it. Sebastian pushed Ethan to think differently, to challenge himself. There was no safety net in his world, no room for hesitation. But the intensity left Ethan feeling invigorated in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It was as though he'd been sleepwalking through his time at Reed Enterprises, and now he was finally waking up. Late one evening, as they prepared for a high-stakes business trip to Geneva, Ethan found himself seated across from Sebastian in the sleek, minimalist conference room on the top floor of Blackwood Tower. The city lights sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow across the room. Ethan was engrossed in reviewing the final proposal for the negotiations, the quiet hum of the city below filling the silence. Sebastian sat on the other side of the table, his chair slightly reclined, his sharp green eyes fixed on Ethan. He wasn't reviewing any documents. He didn't need to. Sebastian had a near photographic memory and an uncanny ability to cut to the heart of any issue. Instead, he was watching Ethan with an intensity that made the younger man acutely aware of the weight of his gaze. "You're different," Sebastian said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced up, startled by the unexpected comment. "Different?" he repeated, his tone cautious. Sebastian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You don't operate like anyone I've worked with before. You care." Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. "Isn't that what assistants are supposed to do?" Sebastian's lips twitched into a faint smirk, but his gaze didn't waver. "Not like you." The words hung in the air, their weight unsettling Ethan in ways he couldn't quite explain. He tried to brush them off with a light laugh. "Well, I'm just doing my job." Sebastian didn't smile. Instead, he studied Ethan, his expression unreadable. "You're not just doing your job. You're invested. You think 10 steps ahead, anticipate problems before they even happen. Most people in your position wouldn't bother. They'd just take orders and move on, but you're different." Ethan shifted in his seat, his heart beating faster for reasons he couldn't pinpoint. "Maybe I'm just used to dealing with chaos," he said lightly, trying to deflect. Sebastian's smirk deepened. "Chaos doesn't scare you. That's why you're here." Ethan dropped his gaze back to the proposal, his cheeks warming under Sebastian's scrutiny. "I wouldn't go that far." Sebastian's voice softened, taking on an almost teasing edge. "Don't sell yourself short, Ethan. You're a rare find." The compliment caught Ethan off guard, and he looked up again, meeting Sebastian's gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with an unspoken tension that made Ethan's chest tighten. Ethan began, but he stopped himself, unsure of what he was about to say. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, breaking the spell. "We leave for Geneva in the morning. Get some rest. It's going to be a long trip." Ethan nodded, gathering his papers and standing to leave. As he reached the door, Sebastian's voice stopped him. "Ethan," Sebastian called out. Ethan turned, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Yes?" Sebastian's smirk was gone, replaced by a softer expression. "You don't give yourself enough credit. Don't let anyone, including me, make you feel like you're anything less than extraordinary." Ethan's breath caught, and for a fleeting moment, he felt as though Sebastian could see right through him. He nodded mutely and stepped out of the room, his mind spinning. As he made his way to his apartment that night, Ethan couldn't shake Sebastian's words, or the unsettling way they had made him feel. Different, extraordinary, rare. The words echoed in his mind, leaving him with a strange, fluttering warmth in his chest. and he couldn't help but wonder what Sebastian truly saw when he looked at him. The Geneva trip had been a whirlwind of negotiations and high-stakes meetings. As they boarded the private jet to return home, Ethan finally felt a sense of accomplishment. But mid-flight, the pilot announced an unexpected landing at a private airstrip. Ethan's stomach churned as he peered out the window and spotted Alexander Reed standing on the tarmac. His broad shoulders were stiff, his expression unreadable. "What is he doing here?" Ethan muttered. When the door opened, Alexander strode in, his eyes scanning the cabin before locking onto Ethan. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Who said you could leave?" Sebastian stood, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Reed, what's the meaning of this?" Alexander ignored him, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "Come back to the office. Now!" Ethan's pulse raced. "You can't just show up like this." Alexander's voice sharpened. "Do you have any idea what I've been dealing with since you left?" Sebastian's tone turned biting. "Sounds like you can't function without him." Alexander's gray eyes burned as he looked between them. "This has nothing to do with you, Blackwood." Sebastian stepped closer, his smile icy. "Everything to do with him involves me now." Ethan, caught between the two powerful men, felt the air grow thick with tension. The city lights flickered against the darkness as Ethan walked toward the park, where Alexander had asked him to meet. His mind raced, replaying the confrontation on the tarmac. He had left Reed Enterprises to escape, to move forward, but Alexander's presence loomed large, refusing to let him go. Alexander stood near a fountain, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his usual polished demeanor replaced by visible tension. When Ethan approached, Alexander turned, his gray eyes softening for a brief moment before his usual guarded expression returned. "Thank you for coming," Alexander said, his voice low. Ethan crossed his arms, keeping his distance. "What do you want, Alexander?" Alexander hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I wanted to apologize. For everything." Ethan's breath hitched. He hadn't expected an apology. Apologize for what, exactly? For taking me for granted? For making me feel invisible? "Yes," Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly. "For all of it. I messed up, Ethan. I didn't see what was right in front of me." Ethan took a step back, the weight of Alexander's words hitting him like a tidal wave. "Why now? Why not 3 years ago, when I was breaking my back to make your life easier?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched into his features. "Because I was blind. Because I thought you'd always be there, no matter how I treated you. And I was wrong." The vulnerability in Alexander's voice was almost too much for Ethan to bear. He swallowed hard, his chest tight. "You're engaged, Alexander, or did you forget?" "I called it off," Alexander said softly, his gaze imploring. "Because it wasn't real. Because it wasn't you." Tears pricked at Ethan's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "This doesn't change anything. I've moved on." "Have you?" Alexander asked, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "Because I haven't." Ethan turned away, his heart aching. "Goodbye, Alexander." As he walked away, he didn't dare look back. Ethan returned to Blackwood Industries the next day, throwing himself into work to silence the storm of emotions inside him. But Sebastian, ever perceptive, noticed the shift immediately. "Reed got to you, didn't he?" Sebastian asked, his tone sharp but calm. Ethan glanced up from his desk, startled. "What?" Sebastian leaned against the doorframe, his piercing green eyes locked onto Ethan's. "I can see it all over your face. He's in your head." Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping. "He wants me to come back." Sebastian's jaw tightened, and he stepped into the room. "And what do you want?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian crossed the room in a few strides, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Ethan, I need you to listen to me. You're not just another employee to me. You're more than that." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Sebastian?" "I know I'm not good at this," Sebastian interrupted, his voice softening. But I care about you, more than I should. And the thought of you going back to him. He stopped himself, taking a deep breath. I can't lose you. Before Ethan could respond, Sebastian stepped closer, his hand brushing against Ethan's. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through him. Slowly, Sebastian leaned in, capturing Ethan's lips in a tender, heartfelt kiss. Ethan froze for a moment, then melted into the kiss, his resolve shattering. When they pulled apart, his heart was racing. Say something, Sebastian murmured, his voice barely audible. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes glistening. I don't know what to say. Sebastian smiled faintly, his fingers brushing against Ethan's cheek. Then let me give you time. Days turned into weeks, and the turmoil inside Ethan refused to quiet. His thoughts oscillated between Alexander and Sebastian, each man representing a different path, a different future. Alexander, with his controlled precision and the ghost of unspoken feelings, had been a fixture in Ethan's life for so long that leaving had felt like cutting off a piece of himself. But Sebastian had ignited something in Ethan he hadn't realized was missing, a sense of possibility, of being truly seen. Ethan replayed their moments in his mind, Alexander's plea in the park, Sebastian's quiet confession of care, and wrestled with the decision that would change everything. There was no easy choice, no clear path forward. But deep down, Ethan knew where his heart lay. He just had to summon the courage to act on it. On a cold, rainy evening, Ethan found himself standing outside Reed Enterprises. The familiar glow of the building loomed above him, its vastness both comforting and suffocating. For years, this place had been his sanctuary, his battlefield, his home. Now, it felt like a relic of another life. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. The security guard nodded in recognition, letting him through without question. As the elevator ascended, the weight in Ethan's chest grew heavier. His reflection stared back at him in the polished steel doors, his eyes betraying the storm raging inside. When the elevator chimed and the doors slid open, Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping into the familiar corridor. Alexander's office was at the end, its glass walls illuminated by the soft glow of his desk lamp. Ethan could see him inside, hunched over a stack of papers, his focus unwavering. The sight was so familiar, so achingly normal, that it made Ethan's heart ache. Gathering his resolve, Ethan knocked lightly on the door. Alexander looked up, his gray eyes lighting up when he saw who it was. Ethan, Alexander said, standing quickly. His voice held a note of surprise, and something else, hope. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment he simply stood there, taking in the man he had spent years working alongside. Alexander looked different now. The sharp edges of his confidence were softened, replaced by a vulnerability that Ethan had rarely seen. I didn't expect to see you, Alexander said, his voice quieter now. Did you change your mind? Ethan shook his head, his heart pounding. Number, I'm not here to stay. Alexander froze, his expression faltering. Oh. Ethan struggled to find the right words, his chest tightening with emotion. I needed to tell you goodbye. The weight of the words hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Alexander's face fell, his shoulders slumping as the realization sank in. I see, he said softly, his voice barely audible. Ethan hesitated, his resolve wavering at the sight of the sadness in Alexander's expression. For years, he had been the one to fix things, to make Alexander's life easier. Walking away felt like breaking an unspoken promise. But he knew this was the right decision, for both of them. You'll be fine, Ethan said gently. You don't need me to hold everything together. You're stronger than you think. Alexander's gaze dropped to the floor, his jaw tightening. I don't think it's about needing you, Ethan. It's about wanting you. And I think I realized that too late. The raw honesty in Alexander's voice made Ethan's breath hitch. He wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but he knew that would only make things harder. Instead, he forced himself to smile, though it felt fragile. "Take care of yourself, Alexander," he said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Alexander looked up, his gray eyes meeting Ethan's. There was so much he wanted to say, but he nodded, accepting the finality of the moment. "You too." Ethan turned and walked toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. As he reached for the handle, he paused, glancing back one last time. Alexander was still standing by his desk, his figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the lamp. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of the world had finally caught up to him. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Ethan said softly, then opened the door and stepped out. The walk back to the elevator felt like a lifetime. When the doors closed behind him, Ethan leaned against the wall, exhaling a shaky breath. His heart was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, his mind was clear. He had done what he needed to do. Now, it was time to move forward. Ethan's final stop was Sebastian's penthouse office, his heart pounding as the elevator doors slid open. The late evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room in hues of gold and amber. The familiar space felt different now, heavier with the weight of what he was about to do. As he stepped inside, his pulse quickened. Sebastian was at his desk, leaning over a stack of documents, though his usual air of unshakable confidence seemed absent. His sharp green eyes lifted as soon as Ethan entered, and the tension in his shoulders visibly eased. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as though afraid of startling him. "You're here," Sebastian said, his voice low and laced with relief. Ethan nodded, his throat tight as the words he'd rehearsed in his head refused to come out. "I made my decision." Sebastian's green eyes searched his face, his expression carefully controlled, but Ethan could see the faint flicker of apprehension beneath. He took a step forward, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of vulnerability. "And?" Ethan didn't speak right away. Instead, he crossed the room in 3 strides, the distance between them closing in an instant. He reached for Sebastian's hands, his own trembling slightly as he clasped them. Looking up into Sebastian's eyes, he whispered, "I'm choosing you." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Then, Sebastian's expression softened, the faintest hitch in his breath betraying how much the words meant to him. His smile was rare, something Ethan had only seen in fleeting moments. But now it broke across his face, lighting up the entire room with a warmth that made Ethan's chest ache. Sebastian cupped Ethan's face with one hand, his touch gentle yet firm. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to hear that." Ethan didn't reply with words. Instead, he leaned into Sebastian, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both fierce and tender, a culmination of the weeks of tension and unspoken emotions that had built between them. Sebastian's other hand slid around Ethan's waist, pulling him closer, as if afraid to let him go. Time seemed to blur as the kiss deepened, each movement a silent promise. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling in the quiet of the room. "Are you sure about this?" Sebastian asked, his voice softer now, his vulnerability laid bare. Ethan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything." Sebastian's thumb brushed against Ethan's cheek as he smiled again, the rare and genuine expression sending a flutter through Ethan's chest. "Then let's make this count." For the first time in weeks, the tension that had weighed on Ethan's shoulders lifted. In Sebastian's arms, he felt a sense of belonging, of hope, and the promise of something new and unshakable. Months later, Ethan and Sebastian stood on the balcony of Sebastian's penthouse, the crisp night air carrying the faint hum of the city below. The skyline stretched endlessly before them, a sea of twinkling lights that mirrored the stars above. Ethan's hand rested in Sebastian's, their fingers intertwined in a gesture so natural it felt as though they had always been that way. The challenges they had faced together, Alexander's lingering presence, the delicate balance of merging their personal and professional lives, and the occasional self-doubt, felt like distant memories now. They had weathered it all, emerging stronger and more certain of their place beside one another. Sebastian glanced at Ethan, his green eyes soft and filled with the quiet affection he reserved only for moments like these. "Think Reed's over it yet?" he asked, a playful glint dancing in his gaze. Ethan laughed, the sound light and free. "Not a chance," he replied, leaning against Sebastian's shoulder. "You know how he is. He doesn't let things go easily." Sebastian chuckled, his voice rumbling low as he pressed a kiss to Ethan's temple. "Good. Let him regret losing you for the rest of his life." Ethan shook his head, though his smile widened at Sebastian's words. He turned to look up at him, his heart full as he met Sebastian's gaze. "I don't regret a thing," he said softly, his voice carrying a certainty that made Sebastian's smile grow. Sebastian tightened his arm around Ethan, pulling him closer until Ethan's head rested against his chest. "Neither do I," Sebastian murmured, his lips brushing against Ethan's hair. "Not for a second." They stood there in comfortable silence, the city lights stretching out before them like a promise of endless possibilities. Ethan felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him, the kind that came from knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be, with someone who saw him, cherished him, and challenged him in all the best ways. As the cool breeze played through their hair, Sebastian tilted his head slightly, his voice a murmur against the night. "You've made me better, you know." Ethan tilted his head up, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Better?" Sebastian nodded, his expression earnest. "Stronger, softer, happier?" He paused, his smile softening. "You gave me something I didn't even know I needed." Ethan's cheeks warmed, and he shifted closer, their foreheads brushing as he whispered, "You gave me the same." With the city as their witness, they leaned into each other, their love unshakable, their connection solidified against all odds. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt whole,